Let's check in on how the campaign's travelling. Joining me, David Gazard, DPG Advisory Director and former Liberal advisor, and Ebony Bennett, Deputy Director of the Australia Institute. Thanks both for your time. Just taking a temperature, I guess, of where things are at ahead of the debate tonight and what to expect there. It's a narrow path, really, for both parties now for a majority. I'm not a subscriber of the no one can get majority in the mid-30s of primary. I think that's too reductive, if you like. But it's interesting to see where the campaign's at, because initially the lead up to the campaign was all about, you know, the government's in trouble and things haven't transformed for them, but now Labor's path has narrowed as well, I guess.
I think that's right. I think you're seeing bigger swings in modern day politics over a shorter period of time now. That's certainly the case at a state level, and there's a greater disconnection with the voter to the political process. And there's a cacophony of noise from social media in there, and it really does. The campaign really has, or the entire election really has started to focus around the election campaign. And this is where we're seeing, I think now, the race to touch on as many as 30% of voters that are still undecided. It reminds me a bit of the 2004 Latham campaign, where really into the last week it was still a very tight race, and then the handshake kind of crystallised a whole range of people's hesitations about Mark Latham, and there was a very, very late swing back to Howard. And I think kind of the first week or 10 days of the campaign has, if they haven't started to crystallise, there will be more hesitations around the performance of Anthony Albanese, because rather than being able to sit in the back seat of the car and throw rocks, as the PM said, he's actually got to start demonstrating he can drive, and that's a totally different thing. Yeah,
there was a huge number of not just undecideds, but soft Labor supporters before the election. So they're the ones both sides are essentially trying to deal with. I suppose on the other side, Anthony Albanese always said, let's kick with the wind in the last quarter, but some are wondering, with the sort of lack of new policy between Christmas, or post-Christmas, if you like, and now, has meant that not only is he trying to kick with the wind, but he's got three fresh players that are still on the bench that maybe could have come on a bit earlier.
Could have. I think the opportunity for him tonight is that, as you said, there's a lot of undecideds. Anthony Albanese is still quite unknown quantity for a lot of voters. So I think there's a lot of opportunity for him tonight in the leaders' debate to define himself, to define Labor's values and, you know, the policies that they are putting forwards for voters, really connect them to the issues that people care about, like cost of living. But to go back to your point, you know, it is a narrow path to victory for both sides. And I think also interesting this year is the huge number of independent candidates, not just the Teal independents in metropolitan seats, but also independents against the National Party out in the regional seats as well. So whether or not any of them up in the balance of power after the election remains to be seen, but definitely something to watch.
Yeah, and that's the big unknown question, is how much of the other vote is actually converted into seats, and that's the only thing that matters in terms of, you know, does it actually alter the majority-minority pathway? Let's get into some proper policy. Solomon Islands, the government said we've spent more money, we had a step up, but it's failed. And that step up has failed on the government's watch. It has to wear some responsibility for that, surely.
If it's failed on the government's watch, it's failed on the US's watch, it's failed on New Zealand's watch, it's failed on Canada's watch, it's failed on Japan's watch, it's failed on all of the Quad partners, and it's failed on AUKUS's watch. So these are all regional agreements that the Prime Minister's been very active in stimulating and supporting. AUKUS came out of a meeting at the last G7 at which he was invited to speak to about regional security. So there has been a real forward-leaning momentum here around this region and what China's doing. That has stimulated debate now for the last year. Labor has run the policy that we needed a greater diplomatic intervention in China. They've given up that. They're now saying this is a failure. They criticised the PM for tearing up the deal for submarines with France and bringing it to an AUKUS submarine that had greater capacity in this region. They were backing solidly France at the time. They've given up on that. They're now saying we should have done more here. So it's sort of hard to, I think people who are sort of objective watchers who are intelligent around defence and international security policy would be struggling to sort of see where Labor would do any better in this area after they've really been sort of...
It's hard to say because you can't make decisions unless you're in government. I mean, defence experts, some are saying, why wasn't a base actually put as quickly as possible in the region? And even the basic question, I found the answer from Scott Morrison a bit perplexing today, that Maurice Payne would have been too big a presence in the Solomon Islands, and that's why Zetsis Elgia was sent there. That seems a bizarre response.
Well, we've got a large AFP presence, and we've had that for some time in the Solomons.
Surely it's not that the minister has too high a profile. I mean,
yeah, I guess it depends on really you know, if you're the Solomons and you're an independent country and you've got the foreign minister coming in, probably now you've got the interaction. I know the US is sending two senior people to deal with the Solomons or to discuss this with the Solomons now. So this is something that the world is now embracing. But I don't think there's any way that anyone that's objective can sort of say Australia has been right onto this threat through the last 2 years.
Well, as I said, I guess it's hard to know what the alternatives were without being in government, but the result is something's happened that Australia didn't want. Does it show, though, on the flip side, that anyone questioning the need for a US alliance, China's not just theoretically on our doorstep, it's there now? We need that alliance. That's crucial.
Well, but how useful to us is it in the region? You know, the announcement of AUKUS caught all the Pacific leaders by surprise. The Fijian Prime Minister, Frank Bainimarama, was quite critical of the fact that they were the last to know about it after it had happened. And also, you know, made the point that if AUKUS has trillions of dollars collectively to spend on defence, on missiles, on bases, on nuclear submarines, then surely there's money for climate action in the Pacific, which is an existential threat
with Joe Biden's
to Pacific Islands.
Doing a fair bit of driving. But again, if you're going to talk about whether we relied too much on the US alliance, the incumbent, you need to flesh out what the alternative is now. And that's not just hoping China doesn't come to our region. It's here.
Necessarily, our security doesn't always come from the United States either. Certainly not under the agreements that we've got at the moment.
No, but
we
you
need
need
to be
something
looking
on
for
a par
security
with the power of
within
China.
the region as well. We need to be making more allies in the Pacific and in Asia, like
sure.
Japan
I'm not
and
saying that's the
elsewhere
only
as well.
thing, but you need a superpower as well, surely, with China now. The possibility of building a base that close to Australia?
Well, maybe we need to be looking more to the Nordic countries, for example, on the doorstep of Russia, places like Finland, that have had to negotiate between big superpowers within their history as well. They invest much more into diplomacy.
NATO makes a bit of a difference there.
Well, they're not a member of NATO though either.
That's the problem.
Yeah.
You know, if you're not in, we've seen what happens, doesn't that?
But they're strategically not in either, so as not to provoke Russia.
They want to get in now.
Well. They do now, correct? Yeah.
Can I just to take up that point, you know, that the quadrilateral agreement has been forged specifically for this. There are training exercises between India, Japan, the US and Australia going on now. Australia has helped forge that relationship. If climate change was the issue that was a make or break deal in the Pacific, you would not be signing a deal with China, whose climate policy lags far behind Australia.
It doesn't actually.
It most certainly does.
They don't even have a day when they'll peak their emissions.
They have a much bigger task ahead of them than Australia, which everyone in the Pacific realises. But Australia has more than 100 gas and coal projects in the pipeline as we speak that the Pacific has specifically asked them not to engage in.
How many does China have?
I don't know off the top of my head. I know they're a big emitter, but the point is, if we're trying to make these consistent relationships with the Pacific and we're ignoring them, Australia is ignoring them. Let's put aside China for the moment. What is Australia doing? If we're talking about the failures of Australia's policy when it comes to engagement in the Pacific, climate is at the top of the list there for the Pacific leaders.
And it can't be ignored. I take your point around if that's your biggest issue, then China is a strange dancing partner.
Absolutely.
But it is a huge issue for the Pacific. If we want to generally improve ties, regardless of who they're choosing as an alternate, then the better we are in climate change, the more they'll listen to us. They've made that pretty clear, a lot of Pacific leaders.
Well, if that's the make or break issue, you're not signing a deal with China, put it that way. That is clearly not the break or
You'll
make
get
or
a
break
better
issue
audience
for the
as an
Solomons.
Australian leader if you have a better climate policy with Pacific leaders.
But if you're going to make the case now that climate is the issue, you would not be signing a deal with China.
Sure, but this is only one country.
Solomons.
There are many others in the Pacific.
It is part of a general relationship we have across the region. We've supported the Solomon Islands in telecommunications, with policing going right back to the arc of instability days with Indonesia. Australia has a very close relationship. But
We've
they've
also dropped
decided
the
to
ball
jump-
on things like getting rid of the Australian network that used to beam Australian content into 46 countries in the region. You know, we just let that go. We made a deliberate decision
I don't think the
not to
Australian
invest in
network,
that.
and I think I could be backed here by our Sky friends who took up the broadcasting role in that area, to say that we're still providing content into those areas. But again, the Greens have come out recently and said that China's not a risk in the region anyway, right? So that's where the Greens have nailed their colours to the mast.
All right.
The choice here is between, going forward, is whether you see the coalition as a safer bet looking after regional security of the Labor Party.
Got to leave it there, David and Ebony. Thank you.
Thank you.